Small towns have always been synonymous with routine, comfort, and safety. The kinds of places where everything you need is just a mile away, everyone you see is a familiar face, and the sense of security you feel puts you at ease from the dangers you'd come to expect in a larger city. But it's in the small town of Florence, Montana, that sense of safety would be taken away after the brutal murders of 3 of its residents would leave the town scrambling for answers. This is the story of the Florence murders. "2001 would prove to be a tumultuous year in American history. George W. Bush is inaugurated into the first year of his presidency, months after the Supreme Court had to decide the winner of the 2000 election. The unemployment rate rose to 4.4% due to a recession in March. R&B singer Aaliyah would be killed along with 8 others in a plane crash in late August. And just a few weeks later, strategic terrorist attacks in different locations would change the country forever. But with all the fear that spread throughout the country, some places in the U.S. felt just as safe as they always had. And one of those places was Florence, Montana. Located in Ravalli County with more than a 100-mile distance from the state's capital and a population of less than 1,000 people, Florence offered a refreshing form of peace and quiet to its close-knit community. While petty theft and drug use was heavy in the surrounding areas, violent crime was practically unheard of. It was a kind of place where people felt so comfortable with their neighbors they didn't even bother to lock their doors at night. The only time locals saw people who didn't live there was when travelers would occasionally stop at one of the town's few local businesses while driving down US 93, a major highway that cuts through Florence. One of those local businesses was the Hair Gallery, a salon that operated in a standalone building just off the highway. It was owned by 62-year-old Dorothy Harris. Before opening the Hair Gallery, Dorothy Harris opened a craft shop in the same building that now houses a salon. With more than 30 years' experience in the salon business, Dorothy opened it in January of 2000 to help her nephew, who would later go on to open his own business. The matriarch of a large family who made friends with everyone she met, Dorothy was passionate about providing quality service to her customers and contributing to her community. She was also passionate about providing a good work environment for her employees, which included 44-year-old Brenda Patch. Brenda worked as the salon's manicurist and was described as a loving parent who loved her family. As the salon's solo manicurist, Brenda did the nails of one of the salon's regular customers, 71-year-old Cynthia Paulus. A devoted grandmother who loved sports, she had a standing appointment at the salon every Friday. But with the basketball game happening at the University of Montana on Tuesday, November 6, she decided to switch her appointment to that day. The night before her nail appointment, she and her husband Jerry got an unexpected visit from her son, daughter-in-law, and their grandchildren. While they weren't a very affectionate family, they all knew that Cynthia had a huge heart and loved them all deeply. Her son, Bob Hoblet, had the idea to go and see her on a whim. For some reason, we said, let's pop up and see Mom. So we popped up and saw Mom and Jerry and visited for a while, and they followed us out to the car. And like I said, we were not really a big huggy family, but I gave her a big hug and I told her I loved her, and she said the same. They had no idea, however, that unplanned visit would be the last time they would see her alive. Tuesday, November 6, 2001. A woman drove into the parking lot of the Hair Gallery for her 11 a.m. nail appointment. As she pulled in, she noticed an unusually dressed man wearing a wide fedora hat and a large black coat walking out the front door of the salon. She immediately thought this was strange, not just because of his attire, but because the man had exited through the front door. Everyone knew that the back door was the door that everybody in town used. Nevertheless, she made a mental note of this as she parked her car and made her way to the back entrance. The second she opened the door, she made the horrifying discovery. On the other side was Dorothy Harris, lying in a fetal position, covered in blood. The customer immediately rushed inside the salon to use the phone to call 911. When the police arrived, they would discover 2 more bodies, belonging to Brenda Patch and Cynthia Paulus. Police immediately got to work trying to piece together the cause of death and create a timeline for the murders. They determined that all 3 women had been killed by having their throats slit open. Police also said that they had suffered other injuries, but would not elaborate any further into what they were. The salon was always closed on Sundays and Mondays, so Dorothy would make her weekly deposit every Tuesday morning around 10:30 a.m. Brenda Patch had opened the salon by herself that morning and let Cynthia Paulus in for her appointment before the murderer arrived. Once he came in, he forced both of them into the utility closet where he killed both of them. One official described the room they were found in as a battle scene. The suspect then waited for Dorothy to come back, killing her in the same brutal fashion the moment she stepped inside. The car ride Dorothy took to and from the bank only took about 15 to 20 minutes. That means that the customers stumbled upon the victims just minutes after they were murdered. Since the murders happened just moments before the customer arrived, the most obvious suspect was the man she saw leaving the salon. The oddly dressed man was described as being a young white male, somewhere in his 20s or early 30s. He stood at about 6 feet tall and had very narrow facial features. Several other residents from the surrounding area saw the man leaving and said that he was, quote, walking with a sense of urgency. Bloodhounds were used to try and track the suspect down, only for the scent to give out after several blocks. Without a suspect, investigators then tried to determine a possible motive. Robbery was the first one considered, but was quickly ruled out since nothing of value had been stolen. Cash that the victims had on them had not been taken, and since Dorothy had just made a deposit, there wouldn't have been much cash to take anyways. None of the victims had been sexually assaulted, so that was ruled out as well. None of the victims or family members of the victims were ever classified as suspects, and none of the 3 women had any known enemies. That left one stranger and much more terrifying motive left, that this was a random act of evil, committed with no rhyme or reason by someone who just saw an opportunity to commit mass murder. This sent the townspeople into a state of terror that they had never felt before. I don't think I could overstate it, the amount of fear in that community. Then Sheriff Perry Johnson said, "You could just about touch it when you drove into town. People were terrified." 18-year-old Brian Philly remembers coming home that afternoon only to find the front door locked. "How am I going to get in?" he asked. "We never lock our front door." That's when I heard that someone had come in here and killed those 3 ladies. His mother, Denise Philly, was quoted a few days after the crime took place, saying, "We haven't locked our house in 12 years. We're not in Los Angeles. This is Florence, Montana, for crying out loud." Her son also had this to say about the suspect. "This is such a small town. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody would have recognized someone if he had walked down the street. It must be an out-of-towner or some guy up in the woods we don't know about." While investigators weren't so quick to believe it was a random attack from someone outside of Florence, a similar case just 10 months later would breathe light into that theory. Great Bend is a small town in the center of Kansas. With a population of around 15,000 people, it isn't quite as small as Florence. Like Florence, however, Great Bend is known for a number of U.S. highways that intersect within it, including Route 56, which runs throughout Great Bend itself. On September 4, 2002, at around 5:30 p.m., a woman pulled into the parking lot of the Dolly Madison Cake Bakery, where she was a regular. Like the salon in Florence, this bakery was in a standalone building. As she pulled into a parking space, a man she had never seen before came out and began locking the front entrance. When she got out and approached the front door, the man told her that the bakery was closed for the rest of the day. She thought it was strange that the bakery would be closing so early, especially since 5:30 was usually in the middle of their evening time rush. Not thinking anything else into it, however, she turned around, got back into her car, and drove away. A few hours later, a delivery man used his key to enter through the store's back door. The moment he stepped inside, he found the bodies of 2 women laying in their own blood. The bodies belonged to 79-year-old Mary Drake, a customer who had stopped by to order bread, and 24-year-old Mandy Alexander, a mother of 2 who had just started working at the bakery just 3 days prior. Both victims had been stabbed to death. Like the salon murder, Investigators found it very difficult to determine what the motive was. Both victims had no known enemies. Neither of them had been sexually assaulted. While a small amount of money had been taken from the register, most of the money had been left behind. The murders also took place on one of the city's busiest corners at the height of evening rush. So if robbery was the motive, the culprit was taking a huge risk for such a small amount. Great Bend Police Chief Dean Aiken said, "But what was taken out of there? If robbery was a motive, there's a whole lot of other places they could have gone for a whole lot more money." What was easily determined, however, were the eerie similarities between this case and the Salon murders. Both murders happened in small towns that have busy state highways running through them. Both involved the stabbing deaths of multiple females in small businesses. Both murders occurred during the day without any clear motive, and both murders centered on a mysterious man seen leaving the crime scene by a regular customer just minutes after the murders occurred. There were also similarities in the appearance of the two suspects. The suspect in this case was described as a white male, around 30 to 35 years old, approximately 6'1" to 6'2", weighing about 170 pounds, with collar-length light brown to blonde hair and a slight beard. This description immediately stood out to a man who worked at a motel very close to the bakery. He said that a man fitting that exact description had checked in the day of the murders and checked out the following day. He noted that the man had shaved his head before leaving. Chris Hoffman, who at the time served as Ravalli County's lead detective, didn't seem too convinced that both crimes were committed by the same man. When asked what he thought of any similarities in the murders, he was quoted as saying, "I've heard of the case in Great Bend, but I don't want to say anything more." As time passed, he seemed even less convinced that this was done by someone outside of Florence, and more convinced that the Salon murders were carried out by someone from the area. What I can tell you is that we're at a critical point in the prosecution of this case, and in a few years, they would publicly release the names of their two prime suspects. In 2005, 4 years after the Salon murders, law enforcement revealed that they had finally found a suspect, 29-year-old Brian Walter Weber. Weber was a former drug dealer who grew up in Florence and was already serving a 24-year federal sentence for drug distribution. He was also known to have an extremely violent temper. In 2003, he committed a vicious assault on a man in what was described as a drug deal gone bad. The case dragged on for a while until 2008, when Weber and another man, 33-year-old Lincoln Benavidez, were officially charged for the murders and a slew of other drug-related crimes. It was revealed that Benavidez was the leader of a meth ring in Florence in the late 90s and early 2000s. He would supply various dealers with drugs and expect to be repaid when everything was sold. When the money wasn't returned, Weber acted as his enforcer, brutally beating dealers who had crossed them. Both men were also involved in racketeering. Despite all of this, Weber and Benavidez denied any involvement in the murders. The motive presented by the prosecution was that someone related to the women was a target of drug violence, and that Weber appeared that day to make an example out of the 3 victims. The prosecution against the 2 men went on until October of 2009, when Benavidez, who was accused of orchestrating the killings, took a plea deal. As a result, federal murder charges were dropped in exchange for him pleading guilty to drug charges. 3 months later, prosecutors dropped the murder charges against Weber on the grounds that they didn't have sufficient evidence. Of the 2 witnesses against Weber, one had passed away and the other was found to be an unreliable witness. However, these charges were dropped without prejudice, meaning that if he was tied to any new developments that surfaced in the future, Weber could be charged again. Right after the charges against both of them were dropped, however, all the court records were sealed by Donald W. Malloy, the U.S. District Judge over the state of Montana. Many people believe that this decision to do this was indicative of one of 2 things. The first being that the investigators really did believe Weber was guilty of the murders but had absolutely no evidence to prove it, and that they believed charging him would somehow force him to confess. The second thing being that the records were actually sealed to protect the sheriff's department and the prosecutors themselves. According to some local journalists, The two allegedly used false information to secure an indictment from a grand jury, which could have resulted in a major win for the defense attorneys and a potential career loss for those involved. However, the reason why these records were sealed has never been revealed. As a result, both Benavidez and Weber were sent to prison for drug charges, bringing any progress made in closing the case of the Florence murders to a halt. In the 20 years since the Salon murders, Benavidez has served 12 years of his 25-year prison sentence. Brian Weber, who was placed on probation in 2012, went back into drug distribution and has had several run-ins with the law, his most recent one being in November of 2017. Weber was arrested as part of an FBI sting and charged with possession with intent to distribute. He is currently serving 15 years in prison. For the loved ones of the three victims, however, they're left with a crushing sense of disappointment that this case remains unsolved. Jay Harris, the son of Dorothy Harris, was crushed when the charges against Weber and Benavidez were dropped. It is what it is, and there's nothing we can do about it, but I'd rather have them in prison than walking free. Bub Hoblet, the son of Cynthia Paulus, said that he dreads the month of November. I used to think that someday we, the families of these three beautiful women, would get closure on this. I'm sorry, but I don't think we ever will anymore. I love and miss you terribly, Mom. And there isn't a day that goes by that Brenda Patch's children don't think of her and hope that someday they will have justice. This disappointment is shared with the loved ones of the bakery murders in Great Bend. Kathy Phelps, Matthew Alexander's best friend, described her as a quiet and soft-spoken woman who loved her kids with all of her heart. Mandy was my friend. I don't call many people my friend, but she was one of the few that I did. She has a family that loves and misses her. Mary Drake was a beautiful lady with a beautiful family who loves and misses her too. Their story doesn't deserve to be forgotten and cold, but here we are. Great Bend detective Terry Millard, who retired in 2013, said that the double homicide was the one case that haunts him the most. When asked by a journalist what he thought of the similarities in the bakery murders and the Salon murders, he was quoted as saying, "I think there's a strong resemblance in the composite sketches. We talked to Montana several times. We've shared information, but unfortunately nothing really came of it. That's my biggest regret, that we haven't been able to figure this out." Perry Johnson, who worked as the sheriff and lead investigator of the Florence case, expressed similar remarks. In my career, this ranks as probably the toughest, most important case I ever investigated. This was someone's grandmother, somebody's sister, somebody's mother. We're not going to quit following every lead, and I'm not going to quit hoping that one day this will be solved.